Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Golden Cage. Blake Burke stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the Seattle skyline stretch endlessly before him. At 52, he commanded a tech empire worth $250 million. Burke Dynamics, the cybersecurity firm he'd built from nothing after his military discharge 20 years ago. His reflection showed a man who'd earned every gray hair, broad shoulders, sharp green eyes, and the kind of calm confidence that came from surviving both battlefield explosions and boardroom betrayals. "Mr. Burke?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your wife called. She wanted to remind you about dinner tonight." Blake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Vanessa Burke, born Vanessa Bell in the trailer parks of Alabama, had transformed herself into Seattle's most sought-after socialite since their marriage 5 years ago. At 38, she was stunning in that calculated way that came from expensive surgeries and designer everything. Blake had met her at a charity gala where she'd been working as an event coordinator, charming donors with practice smiles and rehearsed stories about her difficult past. He'd been lonely then, 2 years after his first wife's death from cancer. Vanessa had been attentive, sympathetic, everything he thought he needed. The red flags had been subtle. Her immediate interest in his finances, the way she'd moved her 20-year-old son Derek into Blake's mansion within months of their wedding, her gradual isolation of Blake from his old friends. Derek Burke, legally adopted after the marriage, was Vanessa's masterpiece of manipulation. Where his mother was charming venom, Derek was cold calculation. The boy had Blake's name, but none of his work ethic, spending his days trading cryptocurrency with Blake's money and his nights at exclusive clubs, burning through cash like paper. Blake had tried to connect with his stepson, offering him positions in the company, paying for his education. Derek had taken it all with the entitled indifference of someone who'd never worked for anything. Blake's phone buzzed with a text from his business partner and closest friend, Travis Arnold. "Beer later? Need to talk." Travis had been Blake's sergeant in Afghanistan and now served as Burke Dynamics head of security. He was one of the few people who tried to warn Blake about Vanessa, though Blake had been too infatuated to listen. These days, Travis was the only person Blake truly trusted. The office door opened without a knock, a privilege only family enjoyed. Derek sauntered in wearing a $1,000 tracksuit, his dark hair perfectly styled, scrolling through his phone with practiced boredom. "Blake." Derek never called him Dad, or even stepdad. "Mom wants me to remind you about tonight. Some investors, or whatever. The Hendersons. They're considering a $50 million contract with us." Derek looked up from his phone, genuinely interested for the first time. $50 million? Nice. What do we get paid? The casual we grated on Blake's nerves. Derek had never contributed a single day's work to Burke Dynamics, yet somehow considered himself entitled to its profits. The contract takes time to develop. These things require patience and skill. Right? Derek's attention was already back on his phone. "Oh, and Mom wanted me to ask about the cabin. She's planning some family weekend thing. Wants to know if it's stocked." Blake owned a remote cabin in the Cascade Mountains, a place he'd bought for solitude and reflection. Lately, Vanessa had been pushing for more family time there. "It should be. I haven't been up there in months." "Cool. She's thinking this weekend." Derek headed for the door, pausing to add, "By the way, I need another advance on my allowance. Found this sick investment opportunity." "Your allowance is already more than most people's salaries, Derek." The young man's face hardened, a flash of the real person beneath the casual facade. "Look, Blake, I'm family now. We take care of family, right? That's what Mom always says." After Derek left, Blake stood alone in his office, a growing unease settling in his chest. He'd built his fortune through careful observation and strategic thinking. Those same instincts that had kept him alive in combat and thriving in business were now screaming warnings he'd been trying to ignore. He pulled up Derek's financial records on his computer. As Derek's legal guardian, Blake had access to all his accounts. What he saw made his blood run cold. Over the past 6 months, Derek had been liquidating investments, moving money into offshore accounts Blake couldn't track. The amounts were staggering, nearly $10 million, all technically Derek's inheritance money that Blake had been gradually transferring to him. Blake's hands moved across the keyboard with military precision, diving deeper into the digital trail. What he found next made him reach for his phone to call Travis, then stop. Hidden among Derek's transaction records were payments to a private investigator, a security consultant, and most disturbing of all, a life insurance company that had recently appraised Blake's personal policy. The pieces clicked into place with terrifying clarity. The sudden interest in the remote cabin, Vanessa's insistence on family time, Derek's casual questions about Blake's schedule, his health, his plans. They weren't just stealing from him. They were planning something far worse. Blake Burke had survived Taliban ambushes and corporate hostile takeovers. He'd built an empire from nothing and weathered every storm the business world could throw at him. But he'd never imagined the greatest threat would come from inside his own home. As the Seattle rain began pattering against his office windows, Blake realized he was no longer looking at his reflection in the glass. He was looking at the face of a dead man walking. At least, that's what Vanessa and Derek believed they were looking at. They had no idea they were actually staring at their worst nightmare. Chapter 2. Serpents in Paradise. Blake arrived home to the Burke estate at 7:30. The perfectly manicured grounds lit by discreet landscape lighting that made the 8-bedroom mansion look like something from a magazine cover. Vanessa had insisted on the house when they married. Too big for 3 people, but perfect for the image she wanted to project. The dinner party was already in full swing. Blake could hear Vanessa's melodic laughter drifting from the dining room. No doubt charming the Henderson couple with her carefully crafted stories about rising from poverty to marry Seattle's most eligible widower. She was wearing the diamond necklace he'd bought her for their first anniversary. $200,000 worth of stones she'd picked out herself. Blake. Vanessa glided toward him in a stunning black dress that probably cost more than most people's cars. She kissed his cheek, her perfume, Chanel No. 5, naturally enveloping him. Perfect timing. The Hendersons just arrived. James and Eleanor Henderson were old Seattle money, the kind of people who'd been born wealthy and considered business a gentleman's sport rather than a necessity. Blake had been cultivating their relationship for months, knowing that Burke Dynamics needed their backing to expand into the European markets. Blake Burke. James Henderson stood, extending a firm handshake. Eleanor and I were just hearing fascinating stories about your lovely wife's charity work. Blake smiled, playing his role perfectly while his mind raced through everything he'd discovered that afternoon. Vanessa does amazing work with underprivileged youth. She never forgets where she came from. The irony wasn't lost on him. Vanessa's charity work consisted mostly of photo opportunities and tax write-offs, but she'd crafted a compelling narrative about giving back to communities like the one she'd supposedly escaped. In reality, Blake's private investigators had revealed years ago that Vanessa's sob story about growing up poor was largely fabricated. Her father had been a successful car dealer, and she'd attended private schools before blowing through her inheritance on failed business ventures and bad relationships. Derek joined them for dinner, playing the role of the devoted stepson to perfection. He asked intelligent questions about the Hendersons' foundation, complimented Eleanor's jewelry, and even managed to seem genuinely interested in James's war stories. Blake watched with growing admiration for the performance. Derek was every bit as skilled an actor as his mother. You know, James said over dessert, Eleanor and I were just discussing your family's future succession plans. Always important in businesses like ours. Blake felt Vanessa's hand tighten almost imperceptibly on his arm. Well, Derek here is my heir apparent, Blake replied smoothly, though I plan on being around to annoy him for many more years. The table laughed, but Blake caught the look that passed between mother and son. It was quick, practiced, but unmistakable, the look of conspirators confirming their timeline. After the Hendersons left, promising to have their lawyers draw up the contract, Blake retreated to his study with a glass of whiskey. The room was his sanctuary, lined with military mementos, business awards, and photographs from his previous life with his first wife, Sarah. Sarah had been the opposite of Vanessa, a nurse, genuinely kind, more interested in helping people than acquiring wealth. Cancer had taken her at 42, leaving Blake devastated and vulnerable to exactly the kind of predator Vanessa had proven to be. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Derek entered without waiting for permission, his earlier charm replaced by calculating coldness. "Good dinner," Derek said, pouring himself a whiskey from Blake's personal collection. "The Hendersons seem nice. Rich. They are. And they're considering a very large investment in our company." "Our company." Derek savored the words like fine wine. "I like the sound of that." Blake studied his stepson carefully. "Derek, can I ask you something? Man to man." "Sure. Do you actually want to be part of Burke Dynamics? Really contribute, learn the business, earn your place? Or are you just waiting for me to die so you can inherit it all?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Derek's facade dropped for just a moment, revealing something cold and hungry underneath. Then the mask snapped back into place. "Blake, you're like a father to me. Of course I want to learn from you. But let's be honest. You're not getting any younger, and Mom and I want to make sure we're prepared for the future." "Our future? Of course." Blake raised his glass in a mock toast. "To the future." After Derek left, Blake sat alone in his study, pieces of the puzzle falling into place with disturbing clarity. He pulled out a secure laptop, one neither Vanessa nor Derek knew about, and began making calls to his network of contact from his military and business days. The first call was to Marcus Stratton, a former CIA operative who now ran a private security consulting firm. "Marcus, I need a favor. Full surveillance package, completely off the books." The second call was to his lawyer, a steel-nerved woman named Kathleen Murphy, who'd helped him navigate hostile takeovers and SEC investigations. "Kathleen, I need you to draft some documents. Urgently. And I need you to do it without my regular legal team knowing." The third call was to Travis Arnold. "Travis, remember that cabin security system we discussed? Time to install it. Full package, hidden cameras, the works. And I need it done this week." Blake Burke had spent 20 years building his empire by staying 3 moves ahead of his competitors. Now he was facing the most dangerous game of his life, and the stakes weren't just his fortune. They were his survival. As he worked through the night, planning his counter move, Blake couldn't help but smile grimly. Vanessa and Derek thought they were hunting a wealthy, aging businessman who'd grown soft in his comfortable life. They had no idea they were actually stalking a decorated Special Forces veteran who'd learned to kill before he'd learned to build companies. They wanted to play a game of life and death. Blake Burke was about to teach them the rules. Chapter 3: The Spider's Web. 3 days before the planned cabin trip, Blake sat in his downtown office reviewing the intelligence Marcus Stratton had gathered. The files spread across his desk painted a picture of betrayal so complete it would have been impressive if it weren't directed at destroying him. Vanessa's deception ran deeper than even Blake had suspected. Through a complex network of shell companies and false identities, she'd been systematically infiltrating Burke Dynamics for over a year. The charity work she'd been so passionate about, it was a front for laundering money stolen from Blake's personal accounts. The social events she organized, intelligence gathering operations where she pumped business associates for information about Blake's deals, his security measures, his personal habits. But the most damning evidence was a series of encrypted communications Marcus had intercepted between Vanessa and a man named Jeremy Webb, Derek's biological father and Vanessa's former partner in a string of insurance fraud schemes. Webb had been released from federal prison 6 months ago, around the same time Derek's offshore transfers had begun. Blake studied Webb's photograph, a lean, dangerous-looking man with dead eyes and a record of violence stretching back 2 decades. Insurance fraud, identity theft, 2 suspected murders that couldn't be proven in court. He was exactly the kind of man who would see Blake's fortune as the ultimate score. The plan, according to the intercepted messages, was elegant in its simplicity. A family weekend at the remote cabin. An accidental fire while Blake slept. The old wiring, so tragic. Vanessa would inherit everything as his wife. Derek would get a share as the adopted son, and Jeremy Webb would fade back into the shadows with enough money to disappear forever. They'd already set the groundwork. Vanessa had been carefully documenting Blake's depression and erratic behavior with her personal physician, a man who'd never actually examined Blake, but had been prescribing antidepressants based on Vanessa's descriptions of her worried observations. Derek had been spreading rumors at the country club about Blake's heavy drinking and reckless business decisions. Even their housekeeper had been coached to remember concerning conversations about Blake's mental state. If the fire didn't look accidental enough, they had a backup plan. Blake's medical records would show a man struggling with depression who'd been drinking heavily and taking prescription medications. Suicide would be believable, even expected. Blake's secure phone buzzed. Travis Arnold's voice was grim. Package delivered to the cabin. Full installation complete. You sure about this plan? I'm sure. What about our friend from Portland? Kurt Tracy is standing by. He's not happy about the legal implications, but he owes you from that Kandahar situation. He'll do it. Kurt Tracy was another former Special Forces operator who now worked as a freelance security specialist. Blake had saved Kirk's life in Afghanistan, and some debts could never be repaid with money. Blake's final call was to Kathleen Murphy. The documents are ready, signed, sealed, and filed with 3 separate law firms as instructed. Are you absolutely certain about this course of action, Blake? There might be legal alternatives. Kathleen, they're planning to murder me this weekend. Legal alternatives aren't an option. That evening, Blake played his role perfectly at dinner. He seemed distracted, tired, perhaps drinking a little more wine than usual. When Vanessa suggested the cabin trip as a way to reconnect as a family, he agreed with the weary resignation of a man who'd given up fighting. I think it would be good for us, Blake said, refilling his wine glass. I've been feeling disconnected lately. Maybe some time away from the city will help. Vanessa's hand covered his, her touch warm and comforting. The perfect performance of a concerned wife. I think so too, darling. Just the 3 of us, like a real family. Derek nodded enthusiastically. Mom's right. We never get enough time together. And the cabin's so peaceful this time of year. Blake agreed to leave Friday afternoon, driving up separately since he had meetings that morning. Vanessa and Derek would go up Thursday night to get everything ready. The plan was falling into place exactly as they designed it, and exactly as Blake needed it too. Later that night, Blake sat in his study reviewing the security feeds from the cabin that Travis had installed. He watched as Jeremy Webb conducted his reconnaissance, timing how long it would take emergency services to reach the remote location, 47 minutes. Testing the cellular dead zones, extensive, and identifying the best escape routes, 3 viable options through the forest. Blake had to admire the thoroughness. In another life, Webb might have made a decent soldier. But this wasn't war. This was personal. And Blake Burke had learned long ago that in personal conflicts, the winner wasn't necessarily the strongest or the smartest. The winner was the one willing to go further than their enemy expected. He opened his laptop and began typing a detailed email to himself, scheduling it to be sent Saturday morning. The message contained everything: Webb's criminal history, the intercepted communications, the financial evidence of Vanessa and Derek's theft, even photographs of Webb casing the cabin. If something went wrong with Blake's plan, if he didn't survive the weekend, the evidence would ensure that justice was served one way or another. Blake Burke had built his fortune by taking calculated risks and thinking 3 moves ahead of his competition. This weekend at the cabin would be the ultimate test of those skills. Vanessa, Derek, and Jeremy Webb thought they were setting a trap for a wealthy, isolated businessman. They had no idea they were walking into the spider's web of a man who'd spent years perfecting the art of survival. As Blake sealed the envelope containing copies of all the evidence, his insurance policy, to be opened only if he failed to return by Monday, he found himself thinking about Sarah, his first wife. She'd always believed that good people would be rewarded and evil people would face justice. Blake hoped she was right, because tomorrow he was going to test that theory with everything he had. The game was set. The players were in position. And Blake Burke was about to remind everyone why he'd earned his fortune not through luck or inheritance, but through the kind of ruthless intelligence that had kept him alive when better men had died. Friday couldn't come soon enough. Chapter 4. Into the Fire. Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of overcast sky that made the Cascade Mountains look both beautiful and ominous. Blake drove his Range Rover through the winding forest roads, each mile taking him further from civilization and deeper into the trap his family had prepared for him. The cabin sat on 40 acres of dense woodland, surrounded by hiking trails that Blake had once used for peaceful solitude but would now serve as potential escape routes or hunting grounds. His phone showed no signal, exactly as Jeremy Webb's reconnaissance had revealed. Blake was truly alone now, cut off from help, just as Vanessa and Derek had planned. The irony was perfect. They'd isolated him to make him vulnerable, but isolation was something Blake Burke knew better than most people. He'd survived 3 weeks alone behind enemy lines in Afghanistan. A weekend with his loving family would be a vacation by comparison. The cabin looked exactly as he'd left it months ago: rustic cedar exterior, stone chimney, wraparound porch overlooking the valley below. Vanessa's Mercedes was parked beside Derek's BMW, both cars positioned for quick getaway access. Blake noted the details with practiced eyes. Tire tracks in the soft earth showing a third vehicle had been here recently, probably Webb's car hidden somewhere in the forest. Vanessa emerged from the cabin as Blake parked, her smile radiant and welcoming. She was dressed in expensive outdoor wear that probably cost more than most people's mortgage payments, playing the role of the devoted wife enjoying a rustic retreat. "Darling, perfect timing. Derek's been gathering firewood, and I've got your favorite pot roast in the oven." She kissed him warmly, her performance flawless. "You look tired. This weekend is exactly what you need." Blake allowed himself to be led inside, noting the subtle changes. The cabin's landline phone had been accidentally disconnected. The main circuit breaker box, usually locked, was now mysteriously accessible. Even his emergency satellite communication device had been moved from its usual location in the bedroom closet to somewhere Blake couldn't immediately spot. Derek appeared from the kitchen, arms full of split logs, playing his part with Academy Award-worthy conviction. "Blake, great drive up. I thought we could have a fire tonight. Maybe break out that expensive whiskey you keep here." "Sounds perfect." Blake set down his overnight bag, making a show of stretching his back. "I think I'll take a walk first, clean my head. The drive up always makes me stiff." "Actually," Vanessa said quickly, "dinner's almost ready. Why don't you relax first? You can walk tomorrow morning." Blake smiled indulgently. "Of course. You're right, as always." Over dinner, the conversation flowed with practiced ease. Vanessa told amusing stories about her charity work. Derek discussed his latest investment ideas, and Blake played the role of a successful but increasingly weary patriarch. The pot roast was excellent. Vanessa was genuinely talented in the kitchen, another skill she'd acquired to make herself indispensable to wealthy men. As the evening progressed, Blake noticed the subtle coordination between mother and son. Vanessa kept refilling his wine glass, while Derek distracted him with questions about business strategies. They were trying to get him drunk, not falling down drunk, but relaxed enough to sleep heavily when the time came. "You know," Blake said, accepting another glass of wine, "I've been thinking about retirement lately. Maybe it's time to step back, let you take over more of the day-to-day operations, Derek." The look that passed between Vanessa and Derek was pure hunger, quickly masked but unmistakable to someone looking for it. "That's wonderful to hear," Vanessa said. "You've worked so hard for so long. You deserve to enjoy the fruits of your labor." "We could discuss the transition timeline this weekend," Derek added eagerly. "I've got some ideas about restructuring the company for the future." Blake nodded thoughtfully, then yawned theatrically. "I think I'm going to turn in early. The mountain air always makes me sleepy." "Excellent idea," Vanessa said. "Derek and I will clean up and bank the fire." "Sleep well, darling." Blake kissed his wife goodnight and headed to the master bedroom, playing the part of the unsuspecting victim to perfection. But instead of undressing for bed, he quietly activated the hidden security system Travis had installed, checked the concealed weapons he'd positioned throughout the cabin during previous visits, and settled in to wait. Through the thin walls, he could hear Vanessa and Derek's whispered conversation in the living room. Even without making out the words, their tone was unmistakable, the excitement of predators closing in for the kill. At 11:30, Blake heard the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel outside. Jeremy Webb had arrived for the final phase of their plan. Blake used the bathroom, making enough noise to suggest normal bedtime activity, then positioned himself behind the bedroom door with a clear view of the hallway. The plan unfolded exactly as Blake had expected. Webb entered through the back door. Derek must have left it unlocked. The three conspirators gathered in the kitchen for a final conference, their voices barely audible, but their intent clear. Blake could make out fragments, sleeping heavily. Accelerant in the basement. Make sure the bedroom door is blocked. At 12:15, they made their move. Blake heard the soft sound of liquid being poured throughout the cabin. Gasoline, spreading the distinctive sharp smell despite their attempts to be quiet. They were thorough and professional, creating a fire pattern that would burn hot and fast, destroying evidence while leaving enough structure to support the accidental fire narrative. Blake waited until he heard Derek's voice say, "Okay, that should do it. Jeremy, you better get out of here before we light it." Then came the sound Blake had been waiting for, the scrape of a match being struck. "Burn in hell." Vanessa's voice carried clearly through the thin walls as she threw the lit match. "You should have been more careful about who you trusted, Blake." Derek's cold laughter followed. "Stupid bastard never saw it coming. $250 million, Mom. We're set for life." The fire caught immediately, racing along the gasoline trails with hungry efficiency. Blake could hear his loving family rushing outside to safety, probably positioning themselves where they could watch the cabin burn while appearing to be helpless victims who'd barely escaped the sudden blaze. What they didn't know was that Blake Burke had been planning for this moment since Monday. The cabin's sprinkler system, installed for insurance purposes years ago, was connected to a hidden water tank Travis had equipped with fire-retardant chemicals. Blake activated it now, controlling the burn exactly as he needed it. More importantly, every word of their conversation had been recorded by the hidden surveillance system. Blake now had ironclad evidence of premeditated murder, conspiracy, and arson. Vanessa and Derek had just confessed to trying to kill him for his money, and Jeremy Webb was on camera participating in the crime. Blake smiled grimly as he prepared for the next phase of his plan. Vanessa had told him to burn in hell, but she'd gotten the geography wrong. Hell wasn't where Blake Burke was going. Hell was what he was about to create for them. Chapter 5, Phoenix Rising. The fire department arrived at dawn to find the cabin a smoldering ruin and Blake Burke's grief-stricken family being treated for smoke inhalation by paramedics. Vanessa played her role to perfection, the devastated widow who'd lost everything in the blink of an eye. Derek supported his mother, both of them giving emotional statements to the fire chief about their narrow escape and their inability to save their beloved Blake. "We tried to get to him," Vanessa sobbed into a rescue blanket. "But the flames were so intense, and the hallway was blocked. We barely made it out ourselves." Derek nodded, his face a mask of shocked grief. "He was such a good man. He didn't deserve this. First my real father, then the cancer scare last year, and now this. Mom's been through so much." The fire chief, Captain Rex Eldridge, was appropriately sympathetic. House fires in remote areas were tragically common, especially in older cabins with questionable electrical systems. The preliminary investigation would be routine, insurance adjusters, cause determination, eventual settlement. Vanessa would inherit Blake's entire estate. Derek would receive his substantial trust fund, and life would go on. By noon, the emergency responders had cleared the scene. Vanessa and Derek drove back to Seattle in somber silence, both privately celebrating their successful execution of the perfect crime. Jeremy Webb had vanished back into the shadows, his work complete. That evening, they sat in Blake's study, now Vanessa's study, dividing up their inheritance plans. The house would be sold immediately. Too many memories. Derek wanted to buy a yacht and spend a few years touring Europe while their lawyers handled the estate. Vanessa was considering a move to the French Riviera, where she could reinvent herself as a tragic widow with impeccable taste and unlimited resources. To Blake, Derek raised a glass of Blake's 25-year-old Macallan. He was a real bastard sometimes, but he sure knew how to make money. To Blake, Vanessa agreed, and to never having to pretend to love him again. They were still laughing when the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, casting eerie shadows throughout the mansion. Derek moved toward the electrical panel, cursing about backup generators and power companies, when a voice spoke from the darkness. "Hello, family." Blake Burke stepped into the dim light like a ghost materializing from their worst nightmare. He was dressed in black tactical gear, his face streaked with soot, but very much alive. In his hand was a Glock 19, the same model he'd carried in Afghanistan. Vanessa's wine glass shattered on the marble floor. Derek went white as paper, his mouth opening and closing without sound. "Surprised to see me?" Blake's voice was conversational, almost friendly. "I have to admit, your plan was excellent. Really professional work. Jeremy Webb knows his business." "Blake." Vanessa's voice was barely a whisper. "How are you?" "The fire." "Oh, the fire was quite real. Unfortunately for you, I've been planning for this moment since Monday. Hidden sprinkler system, emergency exit through the basement, and of course, complete video surveillance of your touching final conversation." Blake's smile was arctic. "Something about burning in hell, if I remember correctly." Derek found his voice first, his shock transforming into desperate calculation. "Blake, listen, we can explain." "Explain what?" "That you've been stealing from me for over a year? That you hired Jeremy Webb to help you commit murder? That you've been systematically destroying my reputation to make my death look believable?" Blake pulled out a tablet, showing them footage of their conversation from the cabin. "It's all here, Derek. Every word, every confession, every self-incriminating detail." Vanessa tried to run. Blake's military training kicked in automatically. He was across the room and blocking her path before she'd taken 3 steps. "Sit down, Vanessa. Both of you. We have some things to discuss." They sat, terror replacing their earlier celebration. Blake positioned himself where he could watch both of them while staying near the room's only exit. "Here's what's going to happen," Blake continued calmly. "In about 30 minutes, the FBI is going to arrive with warrants for your arrests. Conspiracy to commit murder, arson, fraud, theft. Jeremy Webb was very cooperative once they showed him the surveillance footage. Apparently, he's not as loyal as you thought." The blood drained from Derek's face. "You can't prove anything. It's just our word against 47 minutes of high-definition surveillance footage, audio recordings of your planning sessions, financial records showing you've stolen nearly $15 million, physical evidence of the arson." Blake shook his head. "Derek, I built my fortune by being smarter than people like you. Did you really think I wouldn't see this coming?" Vanessa was hyperventilating, her carefully constructed facade crumbling completely. "Blake, please, we can work something out. I'll give it all back. We can get divorced. You never have to see us again." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong." Blake's voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than shouting. "You see, you made this personal when you decided to murder me for money. And I take personal attacks very, very seriously." The sound of vehicles arriving outside made Derek jump like a startled rabbit. Through the window, they could see FBI vans surrounding the mansion, armed agents taking positions. "The thing is," Blake continued conversationally, "I could have had you arrested Monday, as soon as I discovered your plan. But where's the justice in that? You needed to actually commit the crimes, needed to reveal yourselves completely, needed to burn every bridge and destroy every relationship. Now you have nothing left to fall back on. No money, no sympathy, no way to manipulate your way out of this." The doorbell rang with official authority. Blake moved toward the door, keeping the gun trained on his family. "Blake," Vanessa's voice cracked with desperation. "You can't do this. I'm your wife." Blake paused, looking back at her with something that might have been pity. "Sarah was my wife. You were just a very expensive mistake." As the FBI agents entered the mansion, Blake Burke watched his enemies being handcuffed with the same calm satisfaction he'd felt closing his first major business deal. Vanessa was sobbing. Derek was screaming about lawyers and false accusations, but their words were meaningless now. Justice wasn't always swift, but when it came, it was absolute. Blake Burke had learned long ago that the most dangerous enemy was the one you underestimated. Tonight, Vanessa and Derek had discovered exactly how dangerous their mistake had been. Chapter 6: The Reckoning. 2 weeks after the arrests, Blake sat in Kathleen Murphy's law office reviewing the final pieces of his counterattack. The FBI investigation had moved with remarkable speed once they'd seen Blake's evidence. Jeremy Webb had been arrested in Portland trying to board a flight to Mexico, and his cooperation had filled in the remaining gaps in the prosecution's case. The federal charges are ironclad, Kathleen reported, sliding a thick folder across her desk. Conspiracy to commit murder, interstate fraud, arson, money laundering. They're looking at 25 to life, each. Derek's adoption gives him no claim to your estate now that he's been convicted of attempting to murder you. And Vanessa's prenuptial agreement is void due to her criminal actions. Blake nodded, feeling no satisfaction in the legal victories. Justice was necessary, but it couldn't repair the damage done to his ability to trust, to believe in basic human decency. What about the financial recovery? Better than expected. We've traced most of the stolen funds through their shell companies. Derek's offshore accounts have been frozen by international banking authorities. Jeremy Webb's cut was relatively small. He was hired muscle, not a financial partner. You'll recover roughly 90% of what they stole. Blake's phone buzzed with a text from Travis Arnold. Package delivered to county lockup. Both subjects have received your message. The package was a tablet loaded with Blake's final communication to his former family. Not threats. Blake was too smart for that. Just information. A detailed explanation of how their lives would unfold over the next 25 years. The federal penitentiaries they'd be assigned to, based on their security classifications. The other inmates they'd be sharing space with. The appeals process they'd inevitably attempt, and why those appeals would fail. Most importantly, Blake had arranged for them to understand exactly how thoroughly their old lives had been erased. Vanessa's charity connections had been informed of her fraud. Derek's social circle had been sent evidence of his theft. Every relationship they'd built, every lie they'd told, every bridge they'd used, all burned to ash. There's one more matter, Kathleen said carefully. Vanessa's lawyer has requested a meeting. She wants to make a personal appeal. Blake considered this. Where? County jail. Maximum security visitation. You'd be completely safe, and I'd be present as your representative. Blake Burke had built his fortune by facing problems directly, never running from difficult conversations. Even this one. The King County Jail was everything a person would expect from a maximum security facility. Concrete walls, fluorescent lighting, guards who'd seen every form of human desperation. Blake was led through multiple security checkpoints to a sterile visitation room, where Vanessa sat waiting in an orange jumpsuit. Her perfectly styled hair now pulled back in a simple ponytail, her expensive makeup replaced by the harsh reality of institutional life. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the removal of all the designer accessories that had been her armor in the outside world. When she saw Blake, her face cycled through emotions: relief, fear, anger, and finally, resignation. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. Blake sat across from her at the metal table, Kathleen beside him, taking notes. "You have 5 minutes. I want to explain." "No." Blake's voice cut through her attempt at manipulation. "You want to justify what you did, to make me understand your reasons, to find some angle that might generate sympathy. I'm not interested in your explanations, Vanessa. I know exactly what you are." Her mask slipped, revealing the calculating predator underneath. "You're not innocent in this, Blake. You're cold, controlling, impossible to please. You treated Derek like an outsider. Derek is a sociopath who's been stealing from me since the day you moved him into my house. You raised him to be exactly what he is, a predator who takes what he wants without regard for anyone else." Blake leaned forward slightly. "Just like his mother. I could have been good for you." Vanessa's voice rose, desperation breaking through. "If you'd just been different, if you'd show me real love instead of just buying me things." Real love. Blake's laugh was genuinely amused. "Vanessa, you researched my net worth before our first date. You planned our accidental meeting at that charity gala. You've never felt real love for anyone except yourself." The truth hit her like a physical blow. For just a moment, Blake saw past all her lies to the empty core where a normal person's empathy should have been. "What happens now?" she whispered. "Now you serve your sentence. 25 years to life, most likely. Derek will serve his sentence in a different facility. The justice system doesn't like to keep co-conspirators together. Jeremy Webb will probably die in prison. He's made too many enemies over the years. Blake stood to leave, then paused. There's something you should understand, Vanessa. I'm not destroying your life out of revenge. I'm doing it because you're dangerous. You're a predator who targets vulnerable people, and society needs to be protected from you. If you just stolen my money, we could have worked something out. But you try to murder me, and that crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. As Blake walked away, Vanessa called out one last time, "Blake, what about forgiveness? What about mercy?" Blake stopped at the door, looking back at the woman who'd shared his bed while planning his death. "I learned something in the military, Vanessa. Mercy is something you show to people who are capable of redemption. You're not one of those people." Chapter 7. New Foundations. 6 months after the trials, Blake stood in the same spot where he'd first realized his family was planning to kill him. The windows of his downtown office, looking out over Seattle's skyline. Burke Dynamics had not only survived the scandal but thrived, as clients respected Blake's handling of the crisis and his transparency throughout the legal proceedings. The mansion had been sold, its memories too poisoned to preserve. Blake now lived in a sleek downtown penthouse, smaller but more secure, designed for a man who'd learned the value of keeping his private life truly private. Travis Arnold knocked and entered without ceremony, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who'd seen justice served. "Final report from the prison system," Travis said, handing Blake a folder. "Derek's been transferred twice already. Keeps getting into fights with other inmates. Apparently, he's not as tough as he thought he was. Vanessa's in administrative segregation for her own protection. Word got out about what she was planning to do to you, and the other inmates don't appreciate wannabe murderers." Blake glanced at the report without reading it thoroughly. Their suffering wasn't what interested him anymore. Their neutralization as threats was all that mattered. More importantly, Travis continued, "I've got applications from 3 different security firms wanting to use your case as a template for family threat assessment. You've apparently revolutionized the field of domestic security by proving that the most dangerous enemies are the ones sleeping in your bed." Blake's assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Burke, there's a Charlotte Conway here to see you. She says it's about the charitable foundation." Blake had been building something new from the ashes of his old life, a foundation dedicated to helping victims of domestic fraud and financial abuse. Charlotte Conway was a former federal prosecutor who'd agreed to run the organization, bringing expertise in exactly the kind of predatory behavior Blake had experienced. Charlotte entered the office with the confident stride of someone who'd spent years putting criminals in prison. She was in her 40s, professionally dressed, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Blake, I wanted to update you on our first cases. We've already identified 17 victims of sophisticated family financial fraud schemes. People whose spouses, children, or other relatives were systematically stealing from them while planning more serious crimes." Blake gestured for her to sit. "How can we help them?" "Legal support, financial recovery assistance, and most importantly, security consulting to identify threats before they become lethal. Your experience has given us a blueprint for recognizing these patterns early." As Charlotte outlined the foundation's work, Blake felt something he hadn't experienced in months: genuine purpose. His wealth could do more than just grow. It could protect other people from experiencing what he'd endured. "There's something else," Charlotte said carefully. "We've been contacted by several journalism organizations wanting to tell your story. They think it could help other potential victims recognize warning signs." Blake considered this. Privacy had always been important to him, but staying silent might mean other people would die because they didn't see the signs he'd learned to recognize. "Set up the interviews," he decided, "but I control the narrative, and I won't sensationalize what happened. This is about education, not entertainment." After Charlotte left, Blake sat alone in his office thinking about the strange path his life had taken. A year ago, he'd been a successful businessman with what appeared to be a loving family. Now he was a survivor, a cautionary tale, and possibly a teacher for others facing similar threats. His secure phone rang. Marcus Stratton, his security consultant. "Blake, thought you should know. Jeremy Webb was found dead in his cell this morning. Apparent suicide, but the circumstances are suspicious. Someone wanted him silenced permanently." Blake felt no satisfaction in Webb's death, only wariness. Dead men couldn't reveal information about other cases, other victims, other conspirators who might still be operating. Any evidence of outside involvement? Nothing concrete. But Webb was facing life without parole and had been cooperating fully with federal investigators. His death benefits someone, and it wasn't him. Blake made a mental note to increase his personal security and expand the Foundation's protective services. The case was closed, but the war against predators like Vanessa and Derek would never end. As evening fell over Seattle, Blake Burke looked out at the city lights and felt something approaching peace. Not happiness, that would take time, possibly years, but the satisfaction of knowing he'd not only survived his enemy's attack, but transformed it into something constructive. Vanessa had told him to burn in hell. Instead, he'd built something better from the ashes of what she'd tried to destroy. Sometimes the best revenge wasn't destruction, it was creation. Chapter 8. The Final Truth. 1 year after the trials, Blake was reviewing Foundation reports in his office when Travis entered with an expression Blake had learned to recognize. The look of a soldier bringing bad news. "We've got a problem," Travis said without preamble. Jeremy Webb's death wasn't suicide. FBI forensics just confirmed it was murder, made it look like hanging. And they found something in his cell that changes everything. Travis placed a sealed evidence bag on Blake's desk. Inside was a handwritten note, brief but devastating. The old man suspected. Had to accelerate timeline. He knows about offshore accounts in Switzerland. Clean up everything. Blake studied the note carefully. Webb's handwriting, but the implications were staggering. This suggests there were additional co-conspirators. People we never identified. Gets worse. FBI traced the Swiss accounts Webb mentioned. Vanessa and Derek were part of a larger operation, a network of people who identify wealthy targets, infiltrate their lives, and systematically destroy them for profit. They've been operating for over a decade. Blake's blood ran cold. How many victims? At least 12 confirmed, probably more. Always the same pattern. Attractive woman seduces wealthy widower or divorcee, brings in accomplices posing as family members, gradually isolates the target, then eliminates him. The Swiss accounts contain over $200 million from various inheritances over the years. Blake stood and walked to his windows, processing the magnitude of what Travis was telling him. Vanessa hadn't been an opportunistic gold digger who'd gotten greedy. She'd been a professional killer whose specialty was making murder look like accident or suicide. "There's more," Travis continued. FBI believes the network is still operational. Webb's murder suggests they're cleaning house, eliminating anyone who could identify the other members. Vanessa and Derek are safer in prison than they'd be on the street. Blake's mind raced through the implications. If Vanessa was part of a larger conspiracy, then his survival had exposed their entire operation. The other members would view him as an existential threat. What does the FBI recommend? Enhanced protection, relocation options, and cooperation with their ongoing investigation. They want you to help identify other potential targets and assist in drawing out the remaining conspirators. Blake considered this carefully. Running would mean letting other wealthy men die the way he'd almost died. But actively hunting the conspirators would put him at enormous risk. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Burke, we need to meet. Information about your wife's real employer. Coffee shop on Pine Street, 3 p.m. Come alone or don't come at all." Blake showed the message to Travis, who immediately began running traces on the number while Blake weighed his options. "Could be a trap," Travis warned. "It could be someone with information we need." Blake checked his concealed weapon and reviewed the security protocols they'd established. "I'm going." The coffee shop on Pine Street was exactly the kind of place where someone could meet anonymously, crowded, multiple exits, enough ambient noise to mask conversation. Blake arrived 15 minutes early and positioned himself where he could observe all entrances. At exactly 3 p.m., a woman in her 50s approached his table. Unremarkable appearance, careful movements, eyes that constantly scanned for threats. Former law enforcement or intelligence? Blake judged. Mr. Burke? I'm Agent Bridget Hicks, FBI Financial Crimes Division. I'm working the investigation into your wife's organization. I need your help. Blake studied her credentials carefully before responding. What kind of help? The organization that recruited Vanessa calls itself the Widowmakers. They've been operating internationally for 15 years, targeting wealthy men in the U.S., Canada, and Europe. Vanessa Bell was one of their most successful operatives. Hicks placed a tablet on the table, showing photographs of 12 different men, all wealthy, all dead under suspicious circumstances. These are her confirmed victims. You would have been number 13. Blake recognized several faces from business publications and social events. Successful entrepreneurs, all of whom had died in accidents or apparent suicides within 2 years of remarrying. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew to look for it. Why wasn't this discovered earlier? Because they're extremely sophisticated. Different jurisdictions, years between operations, perfect documentation of their targets, supposed mental health issues. Until you survived and provided evidence, we had no way to connect the cases. Blake studied the photographs of dead men who'd made his same mistake, trusting the wrong woman. What do you need from me? The Widowmakers are trying to eliminate anyone who can expose them. Jeremy Webb was killed to keep him quiet, but you're the primary threat. We want to use that. Hicks leaned closer, her voice dropping. Help us draw them out. Be the bait in a trap that will end their operation permanently. Blake Burke had spent his life taking calculated risks for enormous rewards. This was the ultimate high-stakes gamble, his life against the chance to save countless future victims. But as he looked at the faces of 12 dead men who'd shared his trust in the wrong person, the choice became clear. What's the plan? Chapter 9. The Last Laugh. 3 months later, Blake Burke stood on the deck of his new yacht, the Second Chance, anchored in international waters off the coast of Monaco. To anyone watching, he appeared to be exactly what the Widowmakers were looking for, a wealthy widower who'd overcome tragedy and was ready to trust again. The yacht was beautiful, luxurious, and equipped with enough hidden surveillance equipment to document every conversation within a 100-meter radius. FBI teams were positioned on nearby vessels, while Agent Hicks monitored everything from a command center in the yacht's hidden security room. Blake's new girlfriend, Elena Marquez, was everything Vanessa had been. Stunning, charming, with a carefully crafted backstory designed to appeal to a man seeking companionship after betrayal. What Elena didn't know was that Blake knew exactly who she was, another Widowmaker operative, assigned to his case after months of careful surveillance. The sunset is beautiful, Elena said, joining Blake at the railing. She was wearing a dress that probably cost more than most people's cars, her dark hair perfectly styled, her smile warm and inviting. Thank you for bringing me here. I've never experienced anything like this. Blake smiled, playing his role perfectly. It's nothing compared to what we could have together. I've been thinking about what you said last week, about wanting security, a real partnership. Elena's eyes lit up with what appeared to be genuine emotion, but was actually predatory excitement. According to FBI intelligence, she'd been planning his elimination for 6 weeks, waiting for the perfect moment when they were far enough from shore to make his disappearance believable. Blake, there's something I need to tell you. Elena's voice carried the right note of nervous confession. I haven't been completely honest about my past. I was married before, and it ended badly. He was controlling, abusive. I had to do things to protect myself that I'm not proud of. The confession was perfectly calculated, designed to generate sympathy while subtly introducing the idea that Elena was capable of violence when cornered. It was the same script Vanessa had used, refined over years of successful operations. We all have things in our past we're not proud of, Blake replied gently. What matters is who we choose to be going forward. Through his earpiece, Blake heard Agent Hicks's voice, target vessel approaching from the south. 3 occupants, consistent with the extraction team pattern. Blake's pulse quickened, but his expression remained calm. The Widowmaker's standard operation involved a yacht accident during a romantic getaway. The victim goes overboard during the night. The grieving girlfriend is rescued by a prepositioned boat, and another wealthy man disappears without a trace. "Elena, I want to show you something special," Blake said, taking her hand. "The master suite has a view you won't believe." As they headed below deck, Blake positioned himself according to the plan he'd rehearsed dozens of times. The master suite was equipped with cameras in every corner and reinforced to contain any violence that might occur. Elena admired the luxurious bedroom, her eyes constantly cataloging details: the location of weapons, escape routes, the best staging for Blake's accidental death. She was thorough and professional, exactly like Vanessa had been. "Blake," Elena moved closer, her voice soft and seductive. "I need you to know that everything I feel for you is real. You've given me hope for a future I never thought I could have." It was her final performance, the moment before she revealed her true nature. Blake almost felt sorry for her. She was so skilled at manipulation that she might have been successful in legitimate work if she'd chosen differently. "Elena," Blake said quietly, "I need you to know something too. I know exactly who you are, what you're planning, and why you're here." Her transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The warm, loving woman vanished, replaced by a cold predator whose hand moved toward the knife Blake had known she was carrying. "You should have stayed dead in that cabin," Elena hissed, her accent changing from cultured European to something harder, more dangerous. Blake smiled grimly. "Maybe, but then I wouldn't have been able to give you this." The yacht's lighting shifted to emergency mode as FBI agents erupted from hidden positions throughout the vessel. Elena reached for her weapon, but Blake was faster. Months of preparation and a lifetime of military training allowed him to disarm her before she could complete the motion. The extraction boat Elena had been counting on found itself surrounded by Coast Guard vessels as FBI teams swarmed aboard. The Widowmaker's entire operation, Elena, her support team, and the network coordinators who'd been directing her mission, was captured in a perfectly orchestrated trap. As Elena was led away in handcuffs, she looked back at Blake with pure hatred. "You think you've won? There are others. This organization is bigger than you can imagine." "Maybe," Blake replied calmly, "but it's smaller today than it was yesterday, and tomorrow it'll be smaller still." Agent Hicks emerged from the security room, her expression satisfied. "We got everything: communications with their headquarters, financial transfers, operational plans for at least 6 other active cases. This is the break we needed to roll up their entire network." Blake Burke stood on the deck of his yacht, watching the sun rise over the Mediterranean as federal agents processed the crime scene around him. In the distance, he could see other Coast Guard vessels already moving toward the coordinates where additional Widowmaker operatives were being arrested simultaneously. Vanessa had told him to burn in hell. Derek had laughed at what they thought was his stupidity. Jeremy Webb had considered him an easy target. Elena had assumed he was just another wealthy mark waiting to be harvested. They'd all made the same fundamental error. They'd underestimated Blake Burke. As the yacht headed back toward port, Blake received a message from Charlotte Conway at his foundation. 12 more potential victims identified and protected based on tonight's intelligence. The pattern recognition protocols you developed are saving lives. Blake Burke had lost a family, gained enemies, and discovered that the people closest to him had been planning his murder. But from that betrayal, he'd built something better, a foundation that protected others, a security model that prevented similar crimes, and a partnership with law enforcement that would continue dismantling predatory organizations for years to come. The Widowmakers had tried to make him their 13th victim. Instead, Blake Burke had become their final mistake. As the yacht sailed toward the sunrise, Blake Burke allowed himself a moment of genuine satisfaction. The game was over, the score was settled, and justice had been served with interest. Sometimes the best revenge wasn't getting even, it was making sure your enemies could never hurt anyone else again. And Blake Burke had just made the world a significantly safer place for wealthy men who'd lost their first wives and were foolish enough to trust again. The last laugh, as it turned out, belonged to him. And there you have it, another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there. Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Call. Herbert Durham had always prided himself on being a methodical man. At 42, he ran his construction company with the same precision he applied to everything else in his life. Measured, calculated, and always 3 steps ahead. His calloused hands gripped the shopping cart handle as his 8-year-old daughter, Cassie, skipped beside him, her pigtails bouncing with each step. "Daddy, can we get the chocolate cereal?" Cassie asked, pointing to a colorful box on the shelf. "You know what your mother says about sugar," Herbert replied, his deep voice carrying the hint of a smile. Despite his stern exterior, Cassie was his weakness, the one person who could crack his carefully maintained facade. The Westfield supermarket was unusually crowded for a Tuesday afternoon. Herbert noticed everything. The way the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the squeaky wheel on their cart, the nervous energy of the teenage cashier who kept glancing toward the back of the store. 25 years in construction had taught him to read environments, to spot when something was off. His phone buzzed. Brooke's name appeared on the screen. "Which aisle are you in?" Her voice was tight, controlled in a way that immediately put Herbert on alert. "The cereal aisle." "What?" He kept his tone casual, but his eyes were already scanning the store, cataloging exits and potential threats. "Leave the cart. Take Cassie's hand and walk to the front of the store. Now." The sharpness in Brooke's voice cut through the ambient noise of the supermarket like a blade. Herbert's mind raced. In 12 years of marriage, he'd never heard his wife use that tone. Brooke was many things, controlling, ambitious, sometimes cold, but she was never panicked. "But we're not done shopping," he whispered, instinctively pulling Cassie closer. "I said now." The scream through the phone made several shoppers turn and stare. Without hesitation, Herbert scooped Cassie into his arms and walked briskly toward the front of the store. His daughter's arms wrapped around his neck, and he could feel her trembling. "Daddy, what's wrong?" she whispered. "Nothing, sweetheart. We're just leaving a little early." As they reached the parking lot, Herbert's phone buzzed with a text from Brooke. "Don't come home yet. Go to your mother's. I'll explain later." The drive to his mother's house passed in a blur. Vera Durham lived in the same modest ranch home where Herbert had grown up, and she greeted them at the door with her usual no-nonsense expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, studying her son's face. "Can Cassie stay here tonight?" Herbert asked, already knowing the answer. His mother had always been his anchor, the one constant in a life that had seen its share of storms. "Of course. But what's this about?" Herbert handed Cassie the remote control and waited until she was absorbing cartoons before pulling his mother into the kitchen. "Something happened at the store. Brooke called, told me to leave immediately." She wouldn't say why. Vera's weathered hands gripped the edge of the counter. "That girl's been acting strange lately. Secretive. I've noticed it when she drops Cassie off." Before Herbert could respond, his phone buzzed with a news alert. The headline made his blood freeze. "Active shooter situation at Westfield supermarket. Multiple casualties reported." His hands shook as he opened the article. 3 dead, 7 wounded. The shooter had barricaded himself in the back office before taking his own life. The timestamp showed the incident had occurred exactly 15 minutes after he and Cassie had left. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, but as the shock began to fade, questions flooded his mind. How had Brooke known? Why had she been so insistent about the timing? And why hadn't she wanted them to come home immediately? That night, after putting Cassie to bed in his old room, Herbert sat on his mother's front porch and dialed Brooke's number. It went straight to voicemail. He tried again. Same result. "She saved your life today," Vera said, joining him on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. "Maybe," Herbert replied, but doubt gnawed at him. In his experience, coincidences were rare. Timing like this didn't happen by accident. He spent the night staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of Brooke's call, the way she'd known exactly where they were, the urgency in her voice, the text telling him not to come home. As dawn broke, Herbert made a decision. He was going to find out exactly how his wife had known to save their lives. And if he didn't like what he discovered, someone was going to pay. Chapter 2. The Discovery. Herbert returned home the next morning to find Brooke in the kitchen, calmly preparing breakfast as if nothing had happened. She looked up when he entered, her green eyes unreadable. "Where's Cassie?" she asked. "At Mom's." "She's fine." Herbert studied his wife's face, searching for tells. "We need to talk." Brooke set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. At 38, she was still beautiful, the kind of woman who turned heads at company parties and PDA meetings. But Herbert had learned to see past the surface, to read the calculations behind her smile. "About yesterday, I saw the news alert and panicked. Called you immediately. You called before the news broke." For just a moment, Brooke's mask slipped. Herbert caught it, a flash of something cold and calculating. "I must have gotten confused about the timing. It was traumatic, Herbert. Our daughter could have been killed." Herbert nodded slowly, but his mind was already working. He'd built his business by trusting his instincts, and every instinct was screaming that something was wrong. Over the next week, Herbert began his investigation. He started with their phone records, using his position as the account holder to request detailed logs. What he found made his jaw clench. Dozens of calls to a number he didn't recognize, all made during times when Brooke claimed to be at work or running errands. The number belonged to Jean English. Herbert knew Jean. They'd gone to high school together, though they'd never been friends. Jean had been the golden boy, quarterback, prom king, the guy who'd seemed destined for greatness, but had somehow ended up managing a car dealership in the same small town where they'd all grown up. More digging revealed that Jean had been divorced twice, had a reputation for chasing married women, and had recently filed for bankruptcy. He was also, according to Herbert's research, Brooke's new fitness trainer at the gym she'd joined 6 months ago. The pieces were falling into place, but Herbert needed proof. He installed tracking software on Brooke's phone, a simple app disguised as a battery optimizer that she'd never notice. Within days, he had her complete digital footprint, every text, email, and GPS location. The affair had been going on for 8 months. The messages between Brooke and Jean were explicit, detailed, and filled with discussions about their future together. But it was one particular exchange that made Herbert's blood boil. "Jean, when are you going to tell him?" "Brooke, soon. I just need to time it right. Make sure Cassie and I are protected." "Jean, what about the money?" "Brooke, already transferred to the offshore account. He'll never see it coming." Herbert's fists clenched as he read further. Brooke had been systematically draining their joint accounts, moving money to accounts Jean had helped her set up. She'd also been photographing important documents, business contracts, insurance policies, even blueprints from his construction projects. But the final message thread nearly sent him over the edge. "Brooke, the plan worked perfectly. Got them out just in time." "Jean, you sure he doesn't suspect anything?" "Brooke, Herbert's not that smart. He thinks I save his life. By the time he figures out the truth, we'll be long gone." "Jean, and the shooter?" "Brooke, paid as promised. Too bad, he decided to take the permanent way out. Loose ends tied up." Herbert's hands shook as the implications hit him. Brooke hadn't saved their lives. She'd orchestrated the entire thing. The shooting at the supermarket hadn't been random. It had been a distraction, a way to make herself look like a hero while she completed her theft of his assets. 3 innocent people had died, so his wife could cover her tracks. That night, Herbert sat in his workshop behind the house, surrounded by the tools of his trade. Hammers, saws, power equipment, instruments of creation that could just as easily be used for destruction. He'd built this business from nothing, worked 18-hour days to provide for his family, and his wife had repaid him with betrayal and murder. He thought about Cassie, safe at his mother's house, unaware that her mother was a killer and a thief. He thought about the families of the shooting victims, grieving while Brooke and Jean celebrated their successful heist. Herbert Durham had always believed in justice. But when the system failed, when the guilty walked free while the innocent suffered, sometimes a man had to take matters into his own hands. He began to plan. Chapter 3. The Blueprint. 3 weeks had passed since Herbert's discovery, and he'd fallen into a careful routine. Each morning, he kissed Brooke goodbye and went to work, playing the role of the unsuspecting husband. Each evening, he returned home and asked about her day, nodding sympathetically as she spun lies about her yoga classes and book club meetings. Meanwhile, he gathered intelligence with the same methodical precision he brought to his construction projects. Gene English lived alone in a rented duplex on the outskirts of town. His financial situation was worse than Herbert had initially discovered. The man was drowning in debt, desperate enough to participate in murder for money. His ex-wives had both filed restraining orders against him, and his employee records showed a pattern of harassment complained from female staff at the dealership. Herbert also discovered that Gene had a weakness: gambling. Every Thursday night, he attended an illegal poker game in the back room of Murphy's Bar, a dive establishment on the wrong side of town where cash changed hands and questions weren't asked. Brooke's schedule was equally predictable. She met Gene at a cheap motel every Tuesday and Friday afternoon, telling Herbert she was at the gym. She'd also been making regular trips to a storage unit across town, where Herbert suspected she was hiding stolen documents and possibly cash. But Herbert's most important discovery came from an unexpected source: Marcus Webb, a private investigator he'd hired to dig deeper into the supermarket shooting. Marcus was expensive but discreet, a former police detective who specialized in cases the authorities couldn't or wouldn't pursue. "Your wife's boyfriend has interesting friends," Marcus reported during a meeting at a diner outside of town. "Gene English has been associating with Wilson Burgess, a career criminal who specializes in recruiting desperate people for dirty work." Herbert's jaw tightened. The shooter, Lloyd Haney, 23 years old, struggling with mental health issues, buried in medical debt after his mother's cancer treatment. Someone paid his debts and promised him more money to shoot up the supermarket. "According to my sources, he was supposed to fire some shots and disappear, but he panicked when security showed up. So they recruited a sick kid to commit murder. And when he became a liability, they let him die rather than risk exposure." Marcus slid a folder across the table. "I've got bank records showing payments from one of Gene's shell companies to Haney's creditors. Your wife and her boyfriend are accessories to murder." Herbert studied the documents, his mind already working through the implications. "Can we take this to the police? The evidence is circumstantial. Good enough to raise questions, but not enough for convictions. These people covered their tracks well." Marcus leaned back in his booth. "But that's not why you hired me, is it?" Herbert met the investigator's eyes. Marcus had spent 30 years working cases where the guilty walked free on technicalities, where justice was a luxury the system couldn't afford. He understood that sometimes the law wasn't enough. "I need to know their plans," Herbert said. "When they're leaving, where they're going, how much money they've stolen. And then I'm going to make sure they never hurt anyone again." That evening, Herbert sat in his study reviewing Marcus's intelligence reports while Brooke watched television in the living room. According to intercepted communications, she and Gene were planning to disappear in 2 weeks. They'd already purchased fake identities and had booked flights to Mexico under assumed names. The money they'd stolen, nearly $500,000 from Herbert's business account plus another $100,000 from their joint savings, was already waiting in an offshore bank. They'd also stolen client information from Herbert's business, planning to sell construction plans and property details to competitors. But Herbert had an advantage they didn't know about. He was aware of their entire operation. He began making his own preparations. First, he called his business partner, Dennis Downey, and arranged to take 2 weeks of vacation time. Then he visited his lawyer, ostensibly to update his will, but actually to ensure Cassie would be protected if something happened to him. Most importantly, he began assembling the tools he'd need for what came next. From his construction sites, he acquired materials that couldn't be traced back to him: rope, cable ties, industrial-grade chemicals, and power tools. From his contacts in the demolition business, he obtained items that were harder to find but equally necessary. Herbert had learned patience during his years in construction. Good work took time, careful planning, and attention to detail. The same principles applied to revenge. As he finalized his plans, Herbert thought about the families of the shooting victims. He thought about Lloyd Haney, a sick young man manipulated into murder by people who saw him as disposable. He thought about Cassie, who deserved better than a mother who could orchestrate killings to cover her theft. Brooke and Jean had started this war when they decided innocent lives were acceptable casualties. Now Herbert was going to finish it. The game was about to begin, and only one side knew the rules. Chapter 4. Setting the Trap. Herbert's plan required precise timing and careful choreography. While Brooke believed she was manipulating him, he was actually orchestrating every move like a conductor leading a symphony of destruction. The first phase began on a Monday morning. Herbert arrived at work early and called an emergency meeting with his foreman, Lewis Mann, and his core crew. These were men who'd worked with him for years, who understood that loyalty was a two-way street. "I need some work done off the books," Herbert told them, spreading blueprints across his desk. "Personal project, cash pay, and what happens at the site stays at the site." The project was a renovation of an abandoned warehouse Herbert had quietly purchased through a shell company 3 months earlier. Located in an industrial district that was largely deserted after dark, the building would serve as the perfect venue for what he had planned. While his crew worked on preparing the warehouse, Herbert began the delicate process of feeding information to his targets. Using Marcus Webb as an intermediary, he ensured that Gene English learned about a high-stakes poker game scheduled for the following Thursday, one with a buy-in large enough to attract serious players and serious money. The game was real, but Herbert had convinced the organizer, Santos Clifford, to let him host it at a different location. Santos owed Herbert a favor from a construction job that had saved his bar from bankruptcy, and he didn't ask questions when Herbert offered to provide a more secure venue. "Better lighting, no police patrols, and I'll cover the dealer fees," Herbert had explained. Santos agreed without hesitation. Meanwhile, Herbert planted evidence that would draw Brooke to the same location. He left carefully staged documents in his home office, blueprints for a non-existent project, financial records showing phantom assets, and correspondence about a valuable construction contract that could be stolen and sold. The beauty of the plan was that both targets would come to the warehouse voluntarily, each believing they were there to further their own schemes. Herbert also made other preparations. He arranged for Cassie to spend the weekend with her grandmother, telling Brooke he wanted to surprise her with a romantic getaway. He cleaned out his legitimate bank accounts, transferring the funds to accounts Brooke couldn't access. Most importantly, he spent hours at the warehouse, fine-tuning every detail of what would unfold there. The space had been transformed into something that looked like a high-end private club. Expensive furniture, professional lighting, a full bar. But beneath the surface, Herbert had installed less obvious features. Soundproofing, reinforced doors with electronic locks, and surveillance equipment that would record everything. By Wednesday evening, all the pieces were in position. Gene had confirmed his attendance at the poker game, bringing the money he'd stolen from Herbert as his stake. Brooke had discovered the planted documents and was planning her own infiltration of the warehouse to steal what she believed were valuable business secrets. Neither knew the other would be there. Neither knew they were walking into a trap. As Herbert lay in bed that night, listening to Brooke's steady breathing beside him, he felt a cold satisfaction settle over him. Tomorrow night would bring justice for Lloyd Haney, for the shooting victims, and for every life these two had destroyed in their pursuit of money. But first, he had one more piece of business to attend to. Thursday morning, Herbert made a call to Wilson Burgess, the criminal who had recruited Lloyd Haney for the supermarket shooting. Using information provided by Marcus Webb, Herbert arranged a meeting under the pretense of hiring Burgess for a job. They met at a truck stop outside of town, where Herbert presented himself as a businessman with a problem that required unconventional solutions. "I need someone to disappear," Herbert told Burgess, sliding an envelope of cash across the table. "Permanently. Someone who's been asking too many questions about a mutual friend named Lloyd Haney." Burgess counted the money with greedy eyes. This mutual friend got a name: Marcus Webb, private investigator. He's been digging into Lloyd's business, and he's getting close to things that should stay buried. The lie came easily to Herbert's lips. Burgess didn't know that Marcus was working for Herbert, didn't know that the mutual friend relationship was fiction. All he saw was easy money for eliminating a potential threat. When and where? Burgess asked. Herbert provided an address, the warehouse where tomorrow night's poker game would take place. He told Burgess that Marcus would be there conducting surveillance, alone and vulnerable. There's just one condition, Herbert added. It has to look like an accident. Nothing that traces back to anyone involved. Burgess nodded, already planning his approach. He had no idea that he was actually being set up to attend the same location where Jean and Brooke would be carrying out their own schemes. As Herbert drove home that afternoon, he mentally reviewed his preparations one final time. 3 targets, each believing they were pursuing their own agenda, each unaware they were walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. Tomorrow night, the warehouse would host more than just a poker game. It would be the venue for a reckoning that had been months in the making. Herbert Durham had always been a builder, a creator of structures that would stand the test of time. But tomorrow night, he would prove equally skilled at destruction. Chapter 5, Convergence. Thursday evening arrived with a light rain that seemed fitting for what Herbert had planned. As darkness fell over the industrial district, 3 separate groups made their way toward the abandoned warehouse, each believing they were alone in their mission. Jean English arrived first, dressed in an expensive suit he couldn't afford and carrying a briefcase containing nearly $200,000 in stolen money. He parked his rented BMW behind the building and entered through the main entrance, where Santos Clifford's security team directed him to the poker room. The game was already in progress when Jean took his seat. Herbert watched from the security office, observing through hidden cameras as his wife's lover tried to project confidence while nursing a whiskey and studying his cards. Jean was a mediocre player whose arrogance exceeded his skill, exactly the kind of mark that serious gamblers loved to exploit. 20 minutes later, Brooke arrived. She parked 2 blocks away and approached the warehouse from the south, dressed in black and carrying a bag of tools for breaking and entering. She'd done her homework, having spent days studying the building's layout and identifying what she believed was the most vulnerable entry point. What she didn't know was that Herbert had been feeding her that information, carefully guiding her to the exact route he wanted her to take. Brooke slipped through a loading dock that Herbert had left conveniently unlocked. Her goal was the office complex on the 2nd floor, where she believed Herbert was storing valuable business documents. She moved through the darkened corridors with confidence, unaware that every step was being recorded. The 3rd arrival came at exactly 9 o'clock. Wilson Burgess entered through a side entrance, carrying a pistol and expecting to find Marcus Webb conducting surveillance. Instead, he found himself in a maze of corridors that seemed to lead nowhere, growing increasingly frustrated as he searched for his target. Herbert watched all 3 from his command center, a converted office space that gave him complete oversight of the warehouse. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The convergence began when Brooke's presence triggered a motion sensor Herbert had installed in the office complex. The alert appeared on his monitor just as Jean was losing heavily at the poker table, his stolen money rapidly disappearing to more skilled players. Herbert activated the next phase of his plan with the press of a button. Electronic locks engaged throughout the building, sealing all exits. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in an eerie red glow. And throughout the warehouse, hidden speakers began broadcasting a message Herbert had prepared. Ladies and gentlemen, you are now participants in an evening of accountability. The poker game stopped as players looked around in confusion. Jean's face went white as he recognized Herbert's voice. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Herbert Durham. My wife and her lover are both in this building tonight, along with the man who helped them murder 3 innocent people. In the office complex, Brooke froze as she heard her husband's voice echoing through the corridors. Her mind raced, trying to understand how Herbert could have known about her plans. Wilson Burgess, meanwhile, had found his way to the main warehouse floor and was trying to force open a door that refused to budge. The reality of his situation was beginning to dawn on him. Jean English, Herbert's voice continued. You're currently losing money that you stole from me at a poker game in the East Wing. The briefcase beside your chair contains evidence of your theft, your affair, and your role in orchestrating a mass shooting. Jean started to stand, but Santos Clifford's security team had already moved to surround him. These were men who understood that crossing Herbert Durham was bad for business. "Brooke Durham, my beloved wife, you're attempting to steal documents from the second-floor office. Unfortunately for you, those documents are forgeries, and your every move has been recorded." Brooke's hands shook as she tried her phone, finding no signal. Herbert had installed jammers throughout the building, and Wilson Burgess, the man who recruited a sick young man to commit murder, you're currently trying to escape through the south corridor. The gun in your jacket won't help you. The doors are reinforced steel, and the windows are bulletproof. The warehouse fell silent except for the hum of machinery and the distant sound of rain on the roof. Herbert let the silence stretch, allowing fear to take hold before continuing. "You all came here tonight thinking you were in control, thinking you were pursuing your own agendas. But you've actually volunteered to participate in something much more important: justice." Herbert's voice changed, becoming colder and more dangerous. 3 innocent people died because of your greed. A young man named Lloyd Haney was manipulated into committing murder and then abandoned to die. My daughter nearly became a victim of your schemes. And you did all of this for money. Through his cameras, Herbert could see the fear in their faces. Jean was surrounded by men who would follow Herbert's orders without question. Brooke was trapped in a corridor with no way out. Wilson Burgess was pacing like a caged animal, his desperation growing with each passing moment. "So now we're going to play a different kind of game," Herbert announced. "One where the stakes are considerably higher than money." The warehouse plunged into darkness as Herbert cut the emergency lighting. When the lights returned a moment later, everything had changed. Jean found himself handcuffed to his chair, the poker game abandoned as Santos and his men revealed their true purpose. Brooke discovered that the corridor she'd been trapped in had filled with a thin mist, not dangerous, but disorienting and frightening. Wilson Burgess was no longer alone. Herbert's construction crew had emerged from concealment, surrounding him with the quiet competence of men who'd built their lives with their hands. "Let the games begin." Herbert's voice echoed through the warehouse, carrying a promise of retribution that made his target's blood run cold. Chapter 6. The Reckoning Begins. In the East Wing poker room, Gene English found himself facing a tribunal he'd never expected. Santos Clifford had cleared the other players from the room, leaving only Herbert's hand-picked jury, men who'd known Herbert for years and understood the depth of his betrayal. "You killed my friend's wife," said Lewis Mann, Herbert's foreman, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years in construction. "Sarah Mitchell. She was buying groceries for her grandkids when your shooter started firing." Gene's face had gone ashen. "I didn't know anyone would actually die. It was supposed to be a distraction, just some shots fired to cause panic." "But people did die," Santos added, his scarred hands folded on the table. 3 people, plus the kid you used as your weapon. That makes you responsible for 4 deaths. Meanwhile, in the second-floor office complex, Brooke found herself in a different kind of maze. The mist Herbert had released wasn't harmful, but it carried a psychological weight that pressed down on her with each breath. As she moved through the corridors, she began to encounter displays Herbert had prepared. Photographs of the shooting victims, copies of her own text messages discussing the plan, and financial records showing every dollar she'd stolen. "You were planning to take Cassie with you to Mexico." Herbert's voice spoke through hidden speakers, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "My daughter was going to become an accessory to murder because her mother valued money more than human life." Brooke's composure finally cracked. "Herbert, please. We can work this out. I'll give back the money. We can go to counseling." "Too late for that, Brooke. You crossed a line that can't be uncrossed when you decided innocent people were acceptable casualties." On the main warehouse floor, Wilson Burgess faced a different kind of justice. Herbert's construction crew had formed a circle around him, their work-hardened faces impassive as they listened to Herbert's voice detailing Burgess's crimes. "This man specializes in recruiting desperate people to commit crimes for him," Herbert announced. Lloyd Haney wasn't his first victim, and he wouldn't have been his last. Wilson Burgess turns human misery into profit. Burgess pulled his gun, but found himself facing 6 men who'd spent their careers working with dangerous equipment and weren't intimidated by a single pistol. "I wouldn't do that," said Dennis Downey, Herbert's business partner, stepping forward. "We're all licensed to carry, and we all have families. You threatening us just makes this easier." As the 3 separate confrontations unfolded, Herbert began to reveal the true scope of his preparation. Every conversation, every movement, every desperate plea was being recorded by high-definition cameras. But this wasn't just about creating evidence. It was about ensuring that the truth would survive whatever happened next. "You're all wondering what comes next," Herbert's voice continued. "Whether I'm going to kill you, turn you over to the police, or just let you go with a warning. The answer is none of the above." In the poker room, Gene's handcuffs were removed, but his freedom was illusory. The room's exits remained locked, and Santos's men made it clear they would prevent any escape attempts. "You're going to call your contact at the bank in the Cayman Islands," Herbert instructed. "You're going to transfer every dollar of stolen money back to my accounts. And then you're going to sign a confession detailing your role in the supermarket shooting. And if I refuse?" Herbert's laugh was cold and humorless. "Then you'll discover what happens to people who murder children for money." Lewis Mann's grandson was at that supermarket, Gene. He's 6 years old, and he still wakes up screaming from nightmares about the shooting. Lewis has very strong opinions about people who traumatize children. In the office complex, Brooke found herself facing a different choice. Herbert had provided her with a phone and a simple ultimatum: call the police and confess to her role in the shooting, or face the consequences of her actions in a more direct manner. "You always said I wasn't smart enough to see through your schemes," Herbert told her. "But I've been recording every conversation you've had with Gene for months. I have evidence of your financial theft, your planning of the shooting, and your complete lack of remorse for the people who died." Brooke's hands shook as she held the phone. "Herbert, I'm your wife. I'm Cassie's mother. You stopped being my wife when you decided to murder innocent people. And Cassie deserves better than a mother who sees other people as disposable." Wilson Burgess, meanwhile, was facing the most direct form of justice. Herbert's crew had produced lengths of rope and were methodically tying him to a chair, their movements efficient and professional. "You recruited a sick kid to commit murder," Dennis Downey told him. "Then you let him die to cover your tracks. In our business, we call that criminal negligence leading to death." Burgess struggled against his bonds. "You can't do this. This is kidnapping. Assault." "What we're doing," Herbert's voice responded, "is giving you the same choice you gave Lloyd Haney. Cooperate and live, or refuse and face the consequences." As the night wore on, the pressure on all 3 targets intensified. Gene found his accounts systematically emptied as Herbert's team used his own banking information against him. Brooke discovered that every escape route had been sealed, every plea for mercy met with recordings of her own callous discussions about the shooting victims. Wilson Burgess learned that his criminal network had been thoroughly infiltrated by Marcus Webb's investigation. But Herbert wasn't finished. The true test was yet to come, and it would determine not just their punishment, but whether any of them had retained enough humanity to feel genuine remorse for what they'd done. The warehouse fell silent as Herbert prepared for the final phase of his plan, one that would force his targets to confront the full weight of their crimes and decide whether they deserved the mercy they denied to others. Chapter 7: Breaking Points. The silence in the warehouse stretched until it became a living thing, pressing against the walls and settling into the bones of everyone present. Herbert had withdrawn his voice, allowing his 3 targets to stew in their fear and contemplate the magnitude of their situation. In the poker room, Gene English sat surrounded by evidence of his crimes, watching as his stolen fortune disappeared transaction by transaction. Santos Clifford operated the laptop with methodical precision, transferring funds back to Herbert's accounts while Gene's hands remained zip-tied behind his back. $237,000, Santos announced. "That's what you stole from a man who trusted you enough to let you into his home." Gene's composure had cracked completely. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he watched his dreams of escape evaporate. "You don't understand." Brooks said Herbert was planning to fire half his crew. We were trying to protect people's jobs. Lewis Mann's laugh was harsh and humorless. My job? The job I've had for 15 years? The job that feeds my family and put my kids through college. He leaned close to Jean's face. You killed my friend's wife to steal money for your escape fund. Don't insult us with lies about protecting anyone. Meanwhile, Brooke had been moved to a different room, one that Herbert had prepared specifically for her. The walls were covered with photographs, crime scene images from the supermarket shooting, family photos of the victims, and pictures of Lloyd Haney before his descent into desperation. Look at them, Herbert's voice commanded through the speakers. Sarah Mitchell, 62 years old, grandmother of 4. David Chun, 37, father of twin daughters. Rebecca Torres, 29, pregnant with her first child. Brooke closed her eyes, but Herbert's voice continued relentlessly. And Lloyd Haney, 23 years old, diagnosed with severe depression and anxiety, buried under medical debt from his mother's cancer treatment. The perfect target for your boyfriend's recruitment scheme. When Brooke opened her eyes, she found herself facing a video screen that began playing security footage from a supermarket. She watched as shoppers fled in terror, as people fell bleeding to the floor, as children screamed for their parents. You orchestrated this, Herbert said. Every scream, every drop of blood, every family destroyed. It all traces back to your decision that money was worth more than human life. On the main warehouse floor, Wilson Burgess faced a different kind of confrontation. Herbert's crew had assembled what looked like a construction site tribunal, complete with materials and tools that served as both props and implicit threats. 23 years old, Dennis Downey said, reading from Lloyd Haney's file. Worked 2 jobs to pay for his mother's chemotherapy. No criminal record, no history of violence. The perfect victim for a predator like you. Burgess had stopped struggling against his bonds, but his eyes still held defiance. The kid volunteered. Nobody forced him to do anything. You paid his debts and promised him enough money to start over, Herbert's voice responded. Then you gave him a gun and instructions to shoot up a crowded supermarket. Well, he panicked and the plan went wrong. You abandoned him to die. Herbert emerged from the shadows, appearing in person for the first time since the night began. He moved between the 3 locations, observing his captives with the same careful attention he brought to construction projects. In the poker room, he studied Jean's collapse with clinical interest. You're not the first man to throw away his life for a married woman, but you might be the first to commit murder for one. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, Jean pleaded. The shooting was Brooke's idea. She said you had insurance policies that would pay out if you died. She wanted to make it look like you were killed in a random crime. Herbert's expression didn't change, but Santos and the other men shifted uncomfortably. The revelation that Brooke had been planning Herbert's murder added another layer to an already complex web of betrayal. Moving to Brooke's room, Herbert found his wife curled in a corner, finally confronting the reality of what she'd done. The video screen continued its loop of security footage, forcing her to watch the consequences of her actions over and over. Please make it stop, she whispered. The way you made it stop for Sarah Mitchell's grandchildren, the way you made it stop for David Chen's daughters. Herbert's voice was steady, but underneath lay a fury that had been building for months. They don't get to see their families again because you decided their lives were less important than your bank account. Finally, Herbert stood before Wilson Burgess, studying the man who'd turned human desperation into profit. Burgess had recruited dozens of people over the years, the desperate, the addicted, the mentally ill, and used them as disposable weapons in crimes that enriched him while destroying them. You're a predator, Herbert said simply. You hunt people when they're at their weakest, when they have no other options, and you turn them into weapons. Lloyd Haney wasn't your first victim, and he wouldn't have been your last. Burgess finally showed a crack in his defiance. What do you want? Money? I can pay you more than whatever they're paying you. I want justice for a 23-year-old kid who died because you convinced him that murder was his only way out of debt. Herbert's voice carried a finality that made everyone in the warehouse tense. I want accountability for 3 innocent people who died because of your schemes. And I want to make sure you never destroy another family. As dawn approached, Herbert prepared for the final phase of his plan. He'd gathered evidence, extracted confessions, and recovered the stolen money. But justice required more than just restitution. It demanded consequences that would ensure these crimes could never be repeated. The three targets had been broken down, their defenses stripped away, their crimes laid bare. Now came the moment when Herbert would decide their fate and whether mercy had any place in true justice. Chapter 8: The Verdict. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the warehouse windows, Herbert Durham stood at the center of his carefully constructed court of justice. Around him, the evidence of months of planning lay spread across tables and screens. Financial records, communications, photographs, and video testimonies that painted a complete picture of conspiracy, theft, and murder. Gene English sat slumped in his chair, the fight gone out of him. The laptop screen showed his accounts had been emptied, every stolen dollar returned to Herbert's control. But more than money had been taken, his dignity, his hope of escape, and his illusions about the woman he'd betrayed everything for. "She was going to kill you," Gene said suddenly, his voice hoarse from hours of interrogation. "Brooke didn't just want the money. She wanted you dead so she could claim the insurance and take Cassie somewhere you'd never find them." Herbert nodded, unsurprised. "I know. I've known for weeks." In the adjacent room, Brooke had stopped watching the security footage. She sat with her knees drawn up, her expensive clothes rumpled and stained with tears. The photographs on the walls seemed to watch her with accusing eyes. "I never meant for anyone to die," she whispered when Herbert entered. "But they did die, and you celebrated their deaths because they covered your theft." Herbert's voice carried no warmth, no echo of the man who'd once loved her. "You sent me a text that night, remember? While families were identifying bodies at the morgue, you were texting about how perfectly everything had worked out." Wilson Burgess, meanwhile, had begun to crack under the weight of his own crimes. Dennis Downey and the construction crew had spent hours detailing every victim Burgess had recruited over the years, every life he'd destroyed in pursuit of profit. 43 people, Dennis announced, reading from Marcus Webb's investigation files. 43 desperate souls you've used as weapons over the past 8 years. Addicts, mentally ill, people drowning in debt. You turned their suffering into your income. Herbert moved between the three rooms like a judge reviewing evidence before sentencing. In each space, he found people who'd convinced themselves their crimes were justified, their victims somehow deserving of destruction. The moment of truth came when Herbert gathered all three in the main warehouse space. They were brought together for the first time since the night began, each seeing the other's degradation and realizing the scope of Herbert's knowledge. "You're going to call the police," Herbert announced. "All three of you. You're going to confess to your roles in the supermarket shopping, the theft, and the conspiracy to commit murder." Gene looked up with desperate hope. "And then what? We go to prison, but we live?" "That depends on whether you choose to do the right thing for the first time in your miserable lives." Herbert activated a large screen that dominated one wall of the warehouse. It showed a conference call setup with 3 separate phone lines, each connected to different law enforcement agencies. FBI, state police, and local authorities were all standing by to receive confessions. "But before you make those calls," Herbert continued, "I want you to understand something about consequences." The screen changed to show surveillance footage from outside the warehouse. 3 graves had been dug in the industrial wasteland behind the building, each marked with a simple wooden cross. "Those graves took my crew 6 hours to dig. They're exactly 6 feet deep, properly measured and professionally excavated. If you choose not to cooperate, if you decide to maintain your innocence or try to implicate others, those graves will be put to use." The temperature in the warehouse seemed to drop 10 degrees. Gene's face went white, Brooke began sobbing, and Wilson Burgess tested his bonds with renewed desperation. "You're bluffing," Burgess said, but his voice shook. "You're not a killer." Herbert walked to a table covered with construction equipment and picked up a pneumatic nail gun. The tool was industrial grade, powerful enough to drive 4-inch nails through steel beams. "I'm not a killer," Herbert agreed. "But I'm a man whose family was targeted for murder, whose life's work was stolen, and whose community was terrorized by people who think other human beings are disposable. Sometimes good men have to do terrible things to protect the innocent. He pointed the nail gun at a wooden beam and fired. The nail drove completely through the 6-inch timber with a sharp crack that echoed through the warehouse. "Here's how this works," Herbert continued. "You each get one phone call to confess. You provide complete details about your crimes, name your accomplices, and accept full responsibility for the deaths you caused. In exchange, you get to live to stand trial." "And if we refuse?" Brooke asked, her voice barely a whisper. Herbert's smile was cold and final. "Then you'll discover that some crimes are too serious for the courts to handle. Some punishments have to be immediate and permanent." The nail gun fired again, this time into the concrete floor. Chips of concrete flew in all directions, leaving a crater where the nail had struck. "Who wants to go first?" The silence that followed was pregnant with the weight of final decisions. Three people who'd thought themselves clever, who believed they could manipulate and murder without consequences, now faced the reality that their victim had been more cunning than any of them imagined. Herbert Durham had built more than a successful construction company. He'd built a trap that had taken months to complete and was now ready to spring shut. The only question was whether his prey would choose confession and prison, or defiance and the graves that waited in the darkness outside. Chapter 9. Justice Served. The first call came from Gene English, his hands shaking as he dialed the FBI field office. Herbert had provided him with the direct number for Agent Richard Stevens, who'd been investigating financial crimes in the region and was very interested in hearing about stolen construction funds and murder conspiracies. "My name is Gene English," he began, his voice cracking. "I need to confess to conspiracy to commit murder, theft of federal funds, and accessory to the deaths of 4 people. Agent Stevens was professional, but clearly surprised by the unsolicited confession. As Gene detailed, the supermarket shooting plot, the theft of Herbert's business funds, and Wilson Burgess's recruitment of Lloyd Haney. Herbert monitored the call while watching his wife and Burgess process their rapidly diminishing options. Brooke went next, calling the state police detective who'd been investigating the supermarket shooting. Detective Wesley Schultz had been frustrated by the lack of leads in the case, and Brooke's confession provided the breakthrough he'd been seeking. "I planned the shooting to cover my theft of my husband's money," she said, each word seeming to physically pain her. "We recruited a mentally ill young man to commit the murders, then abandoned him to die when the plan went wrong." As she provided details about the offshore accounts, the fake documents, and the timeline of the conspiracy, Herbert felt a cold satisfaction settle over him. Justice was being served, but not in the way his targets had expected. Wilson Burgess held out the longest, his criminal experience making him suspicious of easy deals. But when Herbert began cleaning the nail gun with deliberate slowness, Burgess's resolve finally cracked. His call went to the Organized Crime Task Force, where Detective Jeffrey Alvarez had been tracking Burgess's activities for years without enough evidence to make charges stick. The confession was like Christmas morning for law enforcement. "I've been recruiting vulnerable people to commit crimes for 8 years, Burgess admitted. Lloyd Haney was just the latest. I paid his debts and convinced him to shoot up the supermarket as a distraction for a theft operation." As the 3 confessions were recorded and transmitted to authorities, Herbert revealed the final phase of his plan. The warehouse hadn't just been a venue for extracting justice. It had been designed as a comprehensive evidence facility. "Every conversation you've had here tonight has been recorded," Herbert announced. "Every confession, every admission of guilt, every detail of your crimes. But more importantly, every piece of evidence I've gathered over the past 3 months has been simultaneously transmitted to law enforcement agencies." The screen displayed a complex web of information: financial records showing the stolen money's trail, communications between the conspirators, surveillance footage from before and after the shooting, and complete profiles of every victim they created. "Marcus Webb has been coordinating with federal investigators for weeks," Herbert continued. "Your arrests were inevitable. Tonight just determined whether you'd be taken alive or found in those graves outside." Gene's eyes widened with realization. You never intended to kill us. Wrong. I fully intended to kill you if you'd chosen to maintain your innocence. If you'd continued to treat your victims as disposable, I would have returned the favor. Herbert's voice carried absolute conviction. But you made the right choice. You chose to face justice instead of defying it. As dawn broke fully over the industrial district, the sound of sirens approached the warehouse. Herbert had sent GPS coordinates to all 3 law enforcement agencies, along with a complete briefing on what they'd find inside. The arrests were swift and professional. Gene English was taken into custody by federal agents for financial crimes and conspiracy charges. Brooke Durham was arrested by state police for conspiracy to commit murder and accessory to 4 deaths. Wilson Burgess faced the most serious charges: organized crime, conspiracy, and multiple counts of accessory to murder spanning 8 years. But Herbert's plan had one final element that none of them had anticipated. As the last police car disappeared down the industrial road, Herbert activated a series of explosive charges placed throughout the warehouse. The building collapsed in a controlled demolition that left nothing but rubble and dust, destroying any evidence of what had actually transpired during those dark hours. The official story would be simple. An anonymous tip had led to the arrests of 3 co-conspirators in the supermarket shooting. Their confessions provided complete closure for the case, justice for the victims' families, and answers that law enforcement had been seeking for months. 3 weeks later, Herbert sat in his lawyer's office reviewing the final details of his divorce for Brooke. She would plead guilty to all charges and spend the rest of her life in prison. Gene English faced 25 years for his role in the conspiracy. Wilson Burgess would never see freedom again. What about Cassie? His lawyer asked. Herbert's expression softened slightly. His daughter was staying with her grandmother while he arranged for permanent custody. She'd been told that her mother had made terrible choices and would be away for a very long time. She'll be protected, Herbert said simply. From all of this, the stolen money had been recovered and returned to Herbert's accounts. His construction business was stronger than ever, with new contracts coming in as word spread about his family's ordeal and the justice that had been served. But most importantly, Herbert had sent a message that would echo through the criminal community for years to come. Some people couldn't be manipulated, some families couldn't be threatened, and some crimes demanded consequences that the courts couldn't provide. As Herbert drove home to collect his daughter from her grandmother,